I'm Vivek. I'm a sophomore in Yale College, studying computer science and statistics and data science. I'm the co-president for Yale Code for Good, which is an undergraduate organization that seeks to have student project teams with local nonprofits and other community organizations. And we also host a wide range of talks, workshops, hackathons in the intersection of software development for a social purpose.
Hi everyone, I'm Barkley. I'm a junior at Yale majoring in statistics and data science, and I'm a project lead for Yale STEAM. We have been cooperating with the Digital Humanities Lab on a lot of projects, including Beyond Boundaries, this whole seminar. And so what we're focusing on is to explore the cross-boundary of STEM education and art. So we have organized quite a lot of fun activities on campus, playing around with bubbles or having succulent plants and figure out how succulent plants can fit into both the biological aspects and the artistic aspects of expressions. And we also have an activity on campus next week on succulents. So if any of you are interested, feel free to join us next Friday. But today we have a panel of amazing speakers here, each from a different discipline. And we're really interested to hear their presentations. And later on, after their short presentations, we're going to open up to the floor and see if anyone have any more questions. Yeah. And I guess we'll start from Tiffany.
Oh, it's clearly on. Hello. So I'm Tiffany Li, and I'm a resident fellow at the law school's Information Society project. And there I lead an initiative called the Wikimedia and Yale Law School Initiative on Intermediaries and Information. It's a very long name for a very simple concept, which is that I conduct research and have events and programming along the topics of open internet, open knowledge, and open access. Specifically, a lot of my legal research focuses on intermediary liability, or the rules for liability for platforms, tech platforms, like Facebook or Google or Twitter. So when I think about interdisciplinary research or open knowledge or new ways of thinking about humanities or the social sciences, a lot of my knowledge is filtered through my experiences. And law is not really what you may think of as a discipline that is very open to interdisciplinary research. We don't have any fun projects with succulents, for example. I've never seen a project where a law school does something where you grow a plant or take care of an animal in order to learn a principle of law. But we do have some new interdisciplinary work. And my research center does some of it already. So the Information Society project does work on internet and technology law and policy. And obviously we work a lot with public policy, with history, but a lot with scientific folks as well, because the technology industry obviously is very heavily technical. So we work a lot with computer science departments, with data science departments, with the I schools that are popping up all over the nation right now. There's a lot of interdisciplinary work. But specifically, my work is about open internet and open access. And when I submitted the title for my provocation for this short talk, I actually meant to write "The Power of Open," but I typoed it to "The Power I'd Open." And I thought about it for a moment, and actually I think it makes sense, too, to think of it in terms of what sort of power would we try to open up if we could, as people who have knowledge and who try to put out knowledge in the world. So for my work, we think about open internet and threats to open internet and open speech online. So this can include something like, for example, a government completely shutting down internet access, or shutting down or censoring different websites. As many of you know, for example, there's a concept of what people call the Great Firewall in China, which is where many websites are blocked in China, often because they allow for certain news items or certain information that the government doesn't want people to know. But not only that, we also have threats including laws that may be very well-intentioned, but may have negative consequences for open knowledge. For example, we have a number of laws in the EU right now that are trying to set specific rules for tech companies regarding the content that they host online. Now, traditionally, we've had this history of allowing tech companies some immunity. So if they host content that may be illegal for some reason, they may be immune for legal consequences due to some laws that we have in place. However, these new laws kind of get rid of that immunity. And this makes it so that if there's content that is deemed illegal, the company will have to pay a fine or face legal consequences. And the ultimate consequence of that is that these companies just tend to over-censor or block things or filter things out before they even get posted. And that, I think, is a negative consequence, and negative not just for tech companies or internet users, but for the ideas of having open, free speech online and having open knowledge and open access to information. If nothing else, what I research is really how can we further those goals? How can we further open expression, free speech, and the lofty idea of having democratic values that are fueled by people who have knowledge and are able to share knowledge. So that's specifically what I'm working on, but I'm also really interested in knowing how the rest of you and everyone here is able to kind of push those boundaries forward and bring knowledge either to an open space or to the public or to include people who may not normally be included in the conversation. I think those are what really interests me in the themes of today's symposium. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker we'd like to introduce is are Alice Kaplan and Christophe Schuwey from the French department. They'll be presenting on mapping post-war networks and an index for combat from 1944 to 1947.
Great. Alice Kaplan will join us eventually. She has been delayed by task from being a chair. Our project. Okay, thank you. So I think it's quite timely to have a provocative roundtable here about digital humanities, considering what's going on in the chronicles of higher education right now. So whether it is a network map, a digital edition, or a database, digital humanities are meaningful when they renew the way we perceive our objects. And this is what we are trying to do in the Combat project. Use computer to analyze a famous newspaper that is simply too big for one brain. The goal is to challenge received ideas about networks and newspapers in post-war France. So exploring Combat, we are focusing on signed and unsigned articles published in the French daily newspaper Combat from 1944 to 1947. So that's 4 years worth of data. This is a first step in a larger project called Mapping Post-War Networks. So what was Combat and why is it worth mapping briefly? Combat was the most innovative and most admired daily newspaper in post-war France. It begins as an underground resistance newspaper, and at the liberation, the editors, Albert Camus and Pascal Piat, assembled a group of young, forward-thinking writers and intellectuals who reported nationally and internationally on politics and culture. The paper nourished the careers of many important writers and thinkers, and set a high standard among all the post-war newspapers for its style and intellectual ambitions. So because of the very form of this media and the complexity of the epoch, historians of the post-war era have mainly studied individual intellectual trajectories. The individual careers of Camus, of Sartre, Beauvoir have been tracked down on a nearly daily basis, while group biographies such as Sarah Beckwell's lively existentialist Café have woven their intellectual lives together. But because of the way this is shaped, everything was done on a kind of one-to-one history, right? Our Combat Index gives us the opportunity to look at the same period from a radically new angle. Rather than focusing on star individual across the issues of Combat, we explore the networks of writers to understand who wrote for Combat and how the newspaper evolved over time in order to get a different picture of the post-war France network. Post-war France is a period preoccupied with two ideological models, communism and American capitalism. And it is not all clear how Combat navigated these waters, when it veered left, when right. In particular, there is a lot of debate about to what extent Combat was influenced by de Gaulle, the leading figure of the resistance. And some historians think it became Gaullist very quickly, and others insist it resisted. By exploring the newspaper through a network map, we would like to reshape this debate by better understanding the dynamics going on. So the project started with PDFs, and thanks to support from Yale's Digital Humanity Lab, we are working with a searchable PDF of a full collection of combat obtained from the French National Library. And already working with a full text searchable PDF is already doing digital humanities, and it's already changing the way we can work with this source, right? So from this base, we begin to build an index manually. It includes categories that are objective enough to be relevant for a network graph and rich enough to allow us to analyze the data from many angles. So here you can find some of the categories we are indexing. So the technology decides on what we are doing, right? The question we are asking and our perspective on our object, for the better and for the worst. Two challenges, for instance. The first challenge is that obviously a spreadsheet like this does violence to historical complexity. It may seem relatively easy to determine the nationality of a writer, but let's consider the case of Jean Malaquais, for instance. Malaquais, born in Poland, stateless in France, finally naturalized American, writes in French, and won a French literary prize. He publishes an article in Combat explaining American literature to the French. And it's even harder to generalize about the political affinity of the author in a period where the wrong politics could send you to a firing squad, and where the political affinity switched so often. Between 1944 and 1946, there were writers who slid from fascism to communism to anti-communism. So what we are trying to do in these cases is to think from the end, to consider the goal of our analysis. What set of questions do we want to ask to this data? What would it be more relevant to characterize Malaquais as Polish, French, or American, depending on that? Well, Malaquais, returning to France, described in Combat as a French writer with an expertise in American literature, will be categorized as French. Another challenge is obviously collecting the data. And in our case, the more data we have, good data at least, the more pattern we can see. And the data entry has been slow, heroic even, and we're really grateful to our collaborator Robin Prant, Annie de Saussure, Raphaël Véron, and Walid Bouchakour for their contribution. But in the next phase of the project, we had to find more money to be able to digitize, to hire a company to digitize nearly 3,000 pages of Combat, so that's more than 50,000 articles that will be then available for analysis. We will then be able to see this period from a whole new perspective. Who participated in this newspaper, collaborated, then and now as a flagship, and celebrated then and now as a flagship of French freedom? What information did the Combat journalists gather, and where did it come from? So I'm saying we will be able to do that. And this is maybe my provocative point. Just by digitizing this, just by building a network map, digital mapping will not provide us with answers, because digital humanities never do. They help answering a question. And the goal of this network visualization will be to provide us, the researchers, with an interface to delve into those 3 years of Combat. They will allow us to read those 3 years of Combat from a very different angle, signaling unexpected connections, phenomena that would have never been possible to see and to detect reading Combat in the normal way. And that will ultimately invite us to dig into new cases with a whole new set of questions. And this is maybe through this interface that we can do justice to an extraordinary period of the French cultural history and to make visible this remark by Simone de Beauvoir in her Postwar memoir. And I quote, "To be 20 or 25 in September of '54 seemed the most fantastic piece of luck. All roads lay open." Journalist, writer, budding filmmaker were all arguing, planning, passionately deciding as if their future depended on no one but themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. For our next speaker, we have Mr. Joseph Zinter from Engineering and Applied Science and CEID.
So the Center for Engineering, Innovation, and Design, much like the Digital Humanities Lab, is open to all of Yale. And over the last few years, we've developed a very diverse community of people pursuing a variety of really, really interesting projects. What I'd like to do today is just show two very short videos One demonstrates a project that was done in collaboration with the Department of French, and the second will be a collaboration with the Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage.
I think what I wanted to teach the students is the importance of close reading. Why is it important to do close reading in a class, and what does it look to do close reading in context? So when you have this train, you're forced to look closely at the text to produce it. In Zola's text, the train is a metaphor because Zola exaggerates the proportion, but it's also a metaphor for progress, for history, for women, because the train has a women name, for sexuality and desire, and also for human bestiality. I would say that the three main metaphor or three main concepts that the train symbolizes in this text. We were looking at description in French and in English from the text, and we were reading those descriptions to the engineer, and they were trying to, in a way, translate what we were saying into an object, into code. So we were really reading sentences, art, and aiming at translating it into an object. And that was really interesting because I remember Dean Vince was saying that all this process is a translation. Zola was translating the images of train he saw when he was young. Then the text was translated in English, and then this English text was translated into a computer program that ended up printing a 3D train.
Okay. The next example I'd like to show was one from our course, Introduction to Engineering, Innovation, and Design.
Michelangelos David, strong, youthful, standing tall throughout the centuries. But the standing is becoming a problem.
Over time, David has started tilting forward, and so that's creating hairline cracks in the back of its ankles. The sculpture is probably, in a couple centuries, going to fall over.
Michelle knows all about this because she and her fellow students built a way to study it in an introductory engineering class.
Each group gets assigned their own project that helps someone at Yale with the problem that they have.
Michelle's group worked with Yale's Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage, known as the IPCH, which wanted a way to study what happens to sculptures like David over time. The students built this machine, which they nicknamed Fred, and models that mimic the angle and pressure of David's ankles.
Essentially, our design created a machine that applied force downwards until the models that we inserted in between these two plates were compressed enough where they broke.
This is the time, this is the total force that we can see just goes down as the model cracks.
David is made of marble, but the IPCH wants to study the effects of this pressure on multiple materials. So the group also made models out of concrete and clay.
It was definitely a really good experience getting to be hands-on so fast because it really let me see if it was something I wanted to do.
It's really satisfying to me because you see these students who, when they first showed up, they maybe didn't have any background in building things and making things, and now they're doing all this great stuff.
As for David, well, for now, he's still standing tall. Hopefully, with the help of research like this, he can stay that way.
Okay. So just two quick projects to demonstrate the breadth and diversity of the type of work that we're doing. The engineering school is so proud of its work with the humanities that 2 of its last 4 yearly magazines are proudly displaying these projects. So thank you.
Thank you. For our next speaker, we'll have Peter Leonard from the DH Lab. He'll be presenting Every Pixel on the Sunset Strip, Ed Ruscha between Archive and Dataset.
Terrific. So first, I'm really just curious, how many people in the room, raise your hand if you've heard of Ed Ruscha before? That's great. That's more than most. We're really excited to talk today about a really important pop artist, a really important collaboration with the Getty, and some interesting work in computer vision. For those who aren't familiar with Ed Ruscha, he comes from Nebraska, comes to the West Coast, does all sorts of interesting artistic work, painting, photography. He's most famous maybe for the artist's book, Every Building on the Sunset Strip, which I've put two pictures of at the very top of the screen, and at the bottom, Ruscha himself looking at proofs of the book. It's an enormous, complicated volume. It's small in some dimensions, and when you fold it out, it's really long. And you can find copies of this at Yale. At least there's one in the Haas Art Special Collection. I think there's one at the Beinecke, too. I really encourage you to look at Every Building on the Sunset Strip. It's an artist's book created out of an archive that Ruscha himself built by putting a camera in a pickup truck and driving it down the streets of Los Angeles in the 1960s. It's really kind of an early form of Google Street View. And in fact, Ruscha would probably claim he invented the idea of Google Street View. But this is the 1960s. It's black and white, and he sort of carefully hand assembles this in a completely pre-digital era. It's worth pointing out that Ruscha has continued to do this work for decades. There's still vans driving around the city of Los Angeles, manned by his team, putting these things together. This archive of photographs that was built into collections like Every Building on the Sunset Strip has recently come to the Getty. And the Getty Research Institute put out a call for researcher projects to consider how we might think of Ruscha and his work, not just in the context of the couple dozen images that comprise Every Building on the Sunset Strip, but the hundreds of thousands of negatives that nobody's ever seen that go into this long linear visualization, this kind of banal pop art vision of the city. And when the lab applied to be one of the teams that would work with this collection of hundreds of thousands of negatives, we knew that we had a problem on our hands because Ruscha had already accomplished perhaps the most important work with his photography. He had created this really important artist book, and we felt in considering an archive of hundreds of thousands of pictures that we really didn't want to sort of replicate or create a robotic version of the artist book, which already exists in all sorts of special collections. So we decided to take a different path. We wanted to think about building an urban heat map, a sort of geospatial visualization of discrete objects inside the photography. And what this meant is we had to get into the world of semantic segmentation, of masking out what's actually in each image. And so I'll take you through our process for this, but the basic notion to here is that this is a step beyond image captioning. Our cell phones can already tell us what pictures we've taken of cats. That's just a convolutional neural network that can provide image captions. Behind the scenes, they actually know what part of the image that cat is in your pictures, if it's the top or the bottom. A stage beyond that, towards semantic segmentation, is an example on the bottom of this screen. So we have a really complicated image. There's all sorts of things going on here. But a masking recurrent neural network has actually identified the bicycles as discrete from the boy holding out his hand, as discrete from the rider. This is done all by sort of computational work. There's no humans involved at this phase. And so what we wanted to do is see would this technique work on Ed Ruscha's photography. And so this is an actual negative from the Getty Research Institute taken by Ed Ruscha's team in the 60s, and you can see it's the Sunset Strip. And the algorithm has expertly identified a Volkswagen Beetle. Now, what's important about this is that it's never seen a Volkswagen Beetle before, right? It's been trained on much more modern cars. But the convolutional neural network is capable of doing this masking, the semantic segmentation to tell us exactly where the cars are in the specific outlines, not just the bounding boxes. Now, this is actually part of our idea for this interface for building an urban heat map with really semantic segmented objects on it. We've taken the idea of a car just as our first demo. And so you can see here what this might look like. We're looking at a map of Los Angeles, and we have kind of a way of navigating through the city here and looking where particular items are. You'll see that in this case our demonstration is cars, and if you look at the very bottom of the screen, you'll see that we're actually blurring all of the photography, and only things that are crisp are the detected cars at the bottom. We created this heat map, or this sort of visualization of where automobiles are in the map, in Ruscha's photography, but we're not trying to replicate the artist's book. The interface is inspired by the aesthetic of this work, but we really want this to be about something else, to be about discovering the discrete objects within this archive of hundreds of thousands of pieces of urban photography. In addition to finding discrete objects, we want to be able to nuance and get more specific about what's actually in these objects. So one of the things we can do is we can sort of begin the path down the road towards transfer learning, or retraining neural networks to be more specific about what they find. In this image, we've retrained the final layer of a classification network to tell us whether a car is or is not a Volkswagen Beetle. And you can see we get really high accuracy on this. This isn't sort of cherry-picked. This is really great Beetle detector. Now, that's not actually the most important thing. What we want to do is we want to take what we've learned about semantic segmentation and the ability to find objects in an archive of hundreds of thousands of black and white negatives and work with folks who are really interested in the urban history of Los Angeles and the built environment. We're interested in training networks to not find cars, but to find perhaps Art Deco and glass brick, or the red tile of Mission Revival architecture, or maybe even the urban fabric of LA in terms of its benches for buses, its bodegas, its laundromats and stores, even the vanishing amount of single-family bungalow houses that were still present in the 1960s. So that's an early glimpse into our Every Pixel on the Sunset Strip research collaboration with the Getty. We have a brief page of information about this on our website. We look forward to putting more information online soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And at last, we have Philip, Colette, and Jane Garrison presenting to us.
Hi, my name's Phil Corlett. I'm an associate professor in the psychiatry department, and my work focuses on how our brains create the reality that we perceive. And I'm particularly interested in this term here, psychosis, which is the departure from consensual reality that characterizes some serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia. So believing things that don't pertain and perceiving things that aren't really there. And the way that we understand these symptoms is a sort of trade-off or a tension between what we've learned to expect about our world through experience, perhaps captured in something like one of those convolutional neural networks that we just heard about, and then applying what we've learned to what we're currently perceiving. So as you see this rotating mask of Charlie Chaplin's face, something unusual may have happened. The mask is rotating in a clockwise direction and continues to rotate like that. However, as you start to see the inside of the face, your very strong beliefs that faces tend to be convex rather than concave, and that light falls onto convex rather than concave objects in particular ways, will drive you to edit your conclusions about what you're seeing. And we think that's what we do all of the time when we're navigating the world. We think that people who hallucinate in their everyday lives may do that excessively. Did you all see that? So it's a pretty profound, I think, example of how our learning shapes what we see. And in my lab, we've tried to sort of think about ways in which computational architectures might give rise to that learning and how we might model, if you like, hallucinations and delusions in silico. So you can imagine that your brain is just a series of sort of layers of neurons interacting with one another, sending predictions like faces point outwards, downwards, and data going upwards through the network. And you could think about sort of the trade-offs between those networks in terms of predictions that are made and prediction errors. And that the neural machinery in your brain is really helping you weight which thing to believe. In the case of the hollow mask, you're weighted towards your very strong experience in the world that faces tend to point outwards. And in my lab, we try and pick apart the neurochemical mechanisms and neurostructural mechanisms that give rise to these sorts of mechanisms in order to be able to perhaps better treat people who suffer from delusions and hallucinations. But interestingly, we can think about just in a very simple way what might come about if we perturb these networks. So at the lowest levels, we might, if we overweighted people's beliefs at the lower levels of the network, induce very simple, basic hallucinations, the sorts of things that people experience when they take psychedelic hallucinogenic drugs, for example. And at higher doses of those drugs, or in endogenous psychotic illness, complex hallucinations might come about when the whole network is perturbed. And you start to see new objects cut out of whole cloth appearing before our eyes or our ears. Let's see if I can show you this video. So this is an example from some colleagues at Sussex who have taken Google Deep Dream and perturbed the lowest levels of its network, applying it now to a video of the marketplace in Sussex. And you can see these sort of subtle geometric changes that are happening. So it looks sort of unusual, but not unintelligible and not entirely unexpected. It just looks sort of low quality. And like I said, these sort of geometric patterns seem to be the sorts of things that people experience when they take serotonergic hallucinogens like LSD or psilocybin. And just to show you now, what might happen when we make the same sort of manipulation to the highest levels of the network whilst looking at the same video. So now the network has been trained on lots of different photographs, and it's inserting objects into the video that really aren't there. So you can see dogs, puffer fish, eyes seem to be fairly commonly observed. And so just taking this very simple sort of network architecture, we can get some insights into what might be happening, we think, in the brains of people who are on psychedelic drugs and in the brains of people who have psychotic illnesses. And that's all well and good, but there's nothing in there or built into the network that's really perceiving what's sort of unusual or uncomfortable about what you just experienced. Why does it feel so uncanny or uneasy when your brain edits the hollow mask and causes you to see it switching direction? And what would it mean if that uncanniness or uneasiness were not present? And so with the Digital Humanities Lab and also some collaborators at CCAM, we've been thinking about ways in which one might tether two of these networks together in what's called a generative adversarial network. And the simple idea here is that one side of one of these sort of convolutional neural nets might be making suggestions about what's out there in the world, and another side might be critiquing those suggestions, saying that they feel right or that they don't feel right, and rejecting them, and that these two nets may be training one another and ultimately giving rise to a sensation that actually, oh yes, that feels right or that feels wrong somehow. And so that's what we've been trying to explore. These sorts of architectures are currently being used in the Digital Humanities Lab for various projects, and what we're interested in doing is partnering with folks in digital humanities to play around with these network architectures, break them, and see the ways in which they break. See the ways in which we might bias towards generation of spurious information, and see ways in which we might disrupt the critic in order to fool the generator into believing what's out there in the world is radically different from reality. Thank you.
Thank you all of the speakers for these amazing presentations. And next we want to make this more of a discussion based. So we're going to open up the floor, and if any have any questions about any of these projects or questions in general. So I do want to have like a leading question just to open up. So all of the speakers mentioned about the application of like data-driven method and interdisciplinary solutions. But what do you all think is a good disciplinary marriage in your respective field between data, art, humanities, law, and what could potentially be a bad marriage or interdisciplinary solution?
Well, I think something that is incredibly interesting, and thank you for your question about that, is the ongoing debate again that I mentioned about in Chronicles, about the fact that digital humanities are a failure because automated computing calculation doesn't work always in the arts. And I think that the problem is that the debate is not shaped correctly somehow. So a bad application of digital humanities for literature would be to expect the computer to think for us. Simply because it doesn't. I mean, automated car driving is not about a car that is thinking. It is about a car that is reacting in every situation the way it is supposed to react. That is very different. Since in literature we especially want to do not all but that, like not to reproduce, but to seek for something else. And a good application is to use it, and I think that goes, that resonates with all the talks, fascinating talks that have been given there, is as a new interface, like as a new perception of what we already know. Is it a reality? Is the giving access to people by presenting something in a different way that it is normally, and so opening the access, or to turn a book into suddenly something else, highlighting something else, in order either to communicate on this or to give us new clues or new way to approach our objects. So the question makes the digital humanities relevant or not, I would say.
Sure, I'd like to add, I think I see a lot of great interdisciplinary work. I see a lot of legal research that's being done in conjunction with other fields. For example, we have a cybersecurity course at the law school, which is almost purely cybersecurity with very little law, because if you're trying to make laws about cybersecurity, maybe you should know what cybersecurity actually is, right? Like, that's just something that we lack a little bit in lawmaking. So I think if I think of maybe a bad interdisciplinary project, it would really just be the lack of it, I think, in law and policy. So you get a lot of laws and you get a lot of policymakers who don't understand technology or don't understand science or don't believe in science, and this results in bad policy. So that's a big problem, and I'm glad that at least in universities we're working on interdisciplinary work, and hopefully we'll push that forward as well, not just for government, but for industry as too.
So I think an example of a bad collaboration would be sort of falling between two stools and not honoring the sort of important qualities of both sides of an interdisciplinary project. Sort of not being the best scientist and not being the best artist. In my own field, I think one of the fears is if we try and think about mental symptoms in this way, we rob them of their deep and important sort of heritage and meaning for people. And so I'd hate to see any approach that we took to digitize the humanities to forget that these sorts of experiences, these artifacts, these pieces of work are beautiful in their own right, and what I would hope is that any interdisciplinary work would enhance that rather than detracting from it.
Are there any audience questions at this time? Okay, I can ask another. So when you first, what inspired you to get into this interdisciplinary field, and what inspired your introduction of digital methods to your field of interest?
Well, I can say that I was inspired by the digital humanities staff, by Peter Leonard. I was preparing a colloquium on post-war magazines, post-war cultural magazines, and we just started playing around. And I didn't know anything about the digital humanities except having read Franco Moretti's book on distant reading. So I had some kind of intuition about what we might be able to do that an individual researcher couldn't do just going through the pages on a microfilm. I mean, like everyone else, I had the nausea effect of reading microfilm. But I think some of us are doing digital humanities without knowing it. We do look inside to find a passage when we're preparing a class on a book, or we look at Google Books. I mean, it's already there all around us. And what's great about digital humanities is getting the culture to formalize some of these instinctive moods.
So I actually have, part of the reason why I started working in interdisciplinary sort of digital/law issues is because that's just what I started doing during law school. I'm right now leading an initiative that's funded in part by the Wikimedia Foundation, which is a nonprofit that runs Wikipedia. And I'm sure, how many of you have used Wikipedia? Pretty much everybody. And I think that having use those tools through my education really led me to want to work on them and work on creating a world where we could support those things. So one thing I'd be really interested in knowing from all of you, actually, if you don't mind me asking, one of the topics that I work on is the idea of open access. And I know for all of us, open access scholarship is a controversial issue. How can we either get our research out there for the public, either through open access journals or through public scholarship, whether or not you believe public scholarship exists, or other forms like that. I'd be really interested in hearing what you all think about that and how we can kind of move forward bringing a lot of the great research at this university out there to the public.
I'll try and respond. So I agree, it's absolutely sort of essential that we make what we work on and what we produce openly available to the public. I think what needs to change in order to allow that to happen is either for journals to make that easier, or for our funding bodies and institutions to give us resources to make that happen. And I don't see either of those things happening immediately without us being more vocal about the fact that that's what we want. When I write grants to the National Institute of Mental Health, for example, I now build into the budget some funding in order to publish my work open access. It's a different model in the UK. You can't get funding from the Wellcome Trust or the Medical Research Council without committing to publishing everything that you have open access, and they're much more further along than we are in that regard. So I think having conversations like this with people like yourself and raising the profile of that sort of issue is super important, and being committed to it and enacting that commitment as much as possible.
Yeah, maybe I would totally agree, and I would add also the way publication basically are evaluated. I'm thinking here, for instance, of the difference between publishing a critical edition of a work in a book with a publisher or online. This has absolutely not the same weight for a committee, for a resume. So maybe there is also things that could be done to encourage the open access publication. Even if, of course, open access doesn't mean necessarily that it's not a journal, but there is something there still.
Sweet. Thanks for the answers there. At this point, yes, thank you.
Something I think that is connected to these things we've been talking about in a big way to the title even is, so what happens later? What are the ways to think about unintended consequences of this research and unacknowledged forebears of this research, the surveillance state and things like that? How do these things come into play in y'all's work?
Can you elaborate what you mean by the unacknowledged forebearers of the work?
A lot of some of the work comes from entities that have used the algorithms to detect political activity, to target ads in biased ways, things like that. One argument could be that using these in humanistic ways is making a detour of those algorithms. I'm sort of playing around in that area.
I think it's a fascinating question, and I don't think there are any sort of straightforward answers. I think the relationship between something like psychology and motivation and decision making, and entities like Google and Twitter and Facebook is tense to say the least. I think the only way that we can combat that as academics and practitioners is to highlight what's happening and to make these mechanisms as understandable and transparent for the public as possible. I don't think it would help anyone if we turned our backs on this and didn't study it more deeply. That's certainly how I try and handle things with my work, which clearly, has all sorts of potential nefarious implications.
I think that's a really interesting question. Some of my research has been on privacy law, and it gets into these issues. So I have two quick things. There's one project called the All of Us program by the NIH, which seeks to collect the DNA data of 1 million Americans and use that for a public database that can then, ideally generate great medical advances. So this is an interesting example because here you have clearly a well-intentioned project that could lead to breakthroughs in precision medicine and more. But the problem then is that people don't really know what's happening with their DNA data. What does it mean when you give your data to an entity that then owns the data and can do with it what it wants? And there's a line of legal scholarship about law and medicine, about consent to use of DNA samples or blood samples in medical research. For example, there's the issue of whether or not you have any ownership stake in pharmaceuticals that were developed using research that had used samples from certain people, right? So there are these questions, I think, that we have to deal with. But more broadly speaking, if you're just thinking about privacy, I think there are a lot of interesting techniques done right now to protect privacy so that data can be used in these large data science projects. I was recently at a privacy security research event at Google, which is one company that people are concerned about, obviously, for privacy reasons. But they have been just really hiring a ton of great academics, for better or worse. They're taking a lot of great academics into industry to work specifically on privacy and security, de-identifying data, how to use federated learning and other techniques to use the data to find results without actually being able to re-identify the data or being able to connect the data to the data originator. So there is work being done, and a lot of it is interdisciplinary. So again, with this sort of theme, I think there is a lot that could be done to help alleviate what you were talking about.
Thank you for the question. Are there, we can take about 2 or 3 more questions. Does anyone have anything else to say? Okay. Yeah.
I just have a follow-up question on what we mentioned earlier about. I think that one of the some of the main purpose that why we want to digitize things or we want to visualize things is either to help researcher better with their on making some of these breakthroughs on the research, but also on the other hand, being able to present to the general public, making people understand of these some really complicated scientific project. But sometimes this is really a balance because, like for example, like I grew up reading Scientific American, but then it presents certain information in a way that seems interesting, but does not necessarily following the exact like the scientific rigorous process. I'm wondering for many of the researchers here, how do you view that problem on digitizing or visualizing some of these like informations, because some of the critical informations could also lost in the digitization process.
Thank you for this terrific question. I think, again, sorry to get back to that, but yes, that's one of the big things that digitizing is bringing, and it's one of the least discussed thing in a bizarre way. We're on a screen, so we can do things that we couldn't do on paper. And because probably of some cultural background, the visual is kind of the, yeah, it's, we'll see, we'll figure out in the end how we will show this. The important is what is behind. And in fact, getting on the screen and being able to do all the things we can do with the screen and showing things differently, I think is one of the major assets of any digitalization of any kind.
So I work in brain imaging, where we produce map-like representations of statistical tests that make it appear as though parts of the brain are lighting up or are engaged by particular processes. And there have been whole series of papers, almost cottage industries of papers being exchanged. The seductive allure of brain images, the seductive allure of seductive allure by the people who don't agree. And I think, again, it gets down to being clear communicators, telling people that these aren't maps of recorded neural activity, but very circuitously generated, statistically massaged visually doctored images that represent statistical tests nevertheless, but helping people become better consumers will be more and more important, I think, as we go forward.
So we're seeking for one last question from the audience, maybe? If anyone has. Yes.
This sort of gets back to Peter's presentation, but also I think many of them, if you're thinking about the visual in terms of what we are now able to render and what we will be able to render in the future, is that you're really looking at something that is completely nonlinear. I'm an art historian and I'm also an arts information manager, or have been at various points in my life. And one of the things that has been bedeviling to me, aside from copyright, another symposium topic, has been the fact that we often come into the visual realm prejudiced essentially by vocabulary. And the ability to be able to break out of that mold, I think, is truly transformational. So the idea of neural nets or nonlinearity, any way that you can express the visual without having to sort of predicate it by calling it something that is expressed in words, I think is really something that we need to see as very special, and I would say is one of the counter arguments that I would make to whatever was going on in the Chronicle higher ed, which I would have to say is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard.
That's a great comment. I think that one of the things that we're doing in the lab in terms of writing reusable software is to try to allow people to work with cultural heritage objects without necessarily being beholden to their textual description. In libraries in the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, and museums, archives, we oftentimes really prioritize, for good reason, the textual description of visual culture. We need to have an expert look at this and determine who the painter was and where its provenance. That's incredibly important work. The Getty does this, YCBA does this. But there are also new ways of measuring visual similarity or arranging collections at the scale of 100,000 objects based purely on their the analysis of the raster pixels, how they look. And I think one of the things that's most exciting to me in terms of machine vision, in terms of how computers see, is the opportunity not to break away from human description, because human description has within it decades and centuries really of expert provenance and a sort of connoisseurship, but to put that human textual description in conversation with a kind of analysis of the pixels themselves. I think a lot of the work, if those in the room have seen the work of the lab and Doug Duhame in terms of PixPlot and neural neighbors, that's really exciting open source software that we hope to see deployed in even more cultural institutions as an alternate way of considering the visual without having to do something like look for the word horse and miss an image because it's described as equestrian.
Maybe if we could have more questions from the audience, if there's any. Yes.
So, so there's the digital and the humanities, and when I think of those two, it reminds me of digital, like if you're looking at a sound wave and how that's transferred from a symphonic, smooth, curved wave into a digitalized, wave that kind of cuts out some of the nuances. What do you think can be lost possibly, and how can you protect that in the transition, in the marriage or the synthesis between the digital and the humanity? Because as we're talking about how the expert kind of is ruling the kingdom here, and the expert is traditionally kind of a Western white guy, and so the language that kind of comes out of that kind of expertise may overlook the native capacity and the native nuance. So how might digital humanities benefit from kind of expanding the view of what an expert is? This was even mentioned in an earlier work talking about the value of expertise. How would you speak to the need to retain the nuance as we're transitioning it into these digitalized maps?
I think it's a really important question. That's why I only listen to music on vinyl, to avoid any of that quantization that will just totally destroy the sound. There's been really interesting efforts there. There's, I might mispronounce this, but Mukurtu, which is an effort to build a content management system for the GLAM space, which is, originates more in native understandings of knowledge or restriction of knowledge or empowerment of knowledge. That's something that I think a lot of folks, including I just got back from Australia, where people are really thinking about that in Aboriginal context, Torres Strait Islanders context. The great thing, the wonderful thing and the horrible thing about the digital is that, you know, you can build whatever you want with it. So if you want a system that will replicate existing systems of knowledge control, you can do that. You can also do sort of liberative or sort of transcendent approaches that liberate information or present it in different ways. I do think it's a fascinating question you asked about the notion of the quantization or the reduction. I think it's the responsibility of every humanist to say, does the particular model I'm working with, whether that's ASCII or Unicode, whether that's 8-bit color, 24-bit color, a vinyl or CD, does, you know, it's inherently going to be a model of the truth. And so the question is, all, you know, the thing people heard a lot is all models are wrong, some of them are useful. So you as a humanist have to decide, is the model I'm working with, you know, the parallel of the GAN versus the human sort of schizophrenia, is that a useful model, you know, for your particular research question?
Thank you so much for this fascinating question. And if I may, just a quick story, because yes, quantization is breaking some kind of nuances. But if you add enough information, maybe you can get even more nuance. What I mean by that is I'm working on early modern books. And early modern books are by definition hard to find. And I did my PhD in Switzerland, where there were not as much early modern French books as in Paris. So for a long time, everybody doing a PhD in Switzerland on early modern French literature had to work on only some authors, just because there was only modern edition of them existing. So it was basically white males working. Right. When I started my PhD, I was able to access Google Books. So suddenly there was a whole lot of books that weren't available, except if you were living in Paris. To me, here in Switzerland, or to anyone. And also a whole new lot of authors, and the texts were not only available like the text, but in a photographic reproduction of the page. So a lot of things that were reserved to a very specific elite before were available to the entire world. I'm putting big quotes here, but we understand what we're saying there. So suddenly a lot of new authors came into the field and went back into the study, and this expertise that was previously reserved to only just a few people that were able to access these books in this specific library were available and raised new questions, etc. So there is this kind of, we can speak about, yeah, but we don't access the actual book, and it's true, and at the same time, through this quantization, we open the access in a very different way. So,
just a further comment on the ideas of reductionism and models, and that really beautiful George Box quote about usefulness. We learned a lot about how aeroplanes can fly by making balsa wood wings and placing them in a wind tunnel. And we never got mad at ourselves that we couldn't cram our luggage into that wing and take off and leave. Like, we're not aiming for complete descriptions. We're aiming, well, ultimately we want a complete description, but our pathway there is breaking things down and putting them back together again. And I think that's what we're all engaged in.
Thank you again. That's a great question. I think a lot about the issues of knowledge equity and, you know, who is considered an expert. This is something that is kind of an issue for Wikipedia right now, working on a sort of strategy for the next few decades. If you've ever tried to edit Wikipedia, you may have come into knowledge that it's actually not that easy. So you can try to edit, but if you, for example, add something without a reference, it'll get deleted. Or if your reference is deemed not expert enough or not legitimate enough, you might get deleted as well. So this is a problem because there are whole communities around the world that, for example, don't have the same idea of expertise. Maybe their knowledge is mostly oral history. Maybe they don't have as many written records as we do. So it's a question for Wikipedia right now, and for, I'm sure, all of us, about how we look at those types of knowledge and how we evaluate who gets to be an expert in the room, who gets to sit on a panel at Yale University talking about what knowledge is, right? I mean, we don't have anyone from those communities who may not have the benefits of, multiple degrees from fancy universities in order to talk about these things. And if they're not in the conversation, then their knowledge is lost and knowledge doesn't get to them. So that's something I think we have to think about a lot as well, too.
Thank you for your question, and thank you for the wonderful responses. I'd like one last applause for our roundtable speakers. And I'd like to invite Susan Gibbons up to give closing remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Gibbons, and I have the honor of being Yale's University Librarian and Deputy Provost for Collections and Scholarly Communication. It's also been my pleasure to have been able to attend these conferences. This is now our fourth, and therefore can comment on the arc of the conferences and how they have changed over time. Initially, with our first conference, we had a lot of speakers from the outside. We brought them in to help get the conversation started. Today, we're able to fill the room and fill the program with conversations from inside of Yale because we've come so far and there's so many robust projects to be talked about. If you look at the program today, we had speakers who are undergraduates, graduate students, faculty, and librarians. And I'd say there aren't too many conferences that happen on campus that have that mix within that program. Similarly, if you look at the disciplines that were represented, math, data science, law, French, engineering, music, psychiatry, and many more. Again, where else do we have these kinds of opportunities where we can talk across disciplines and talk in meaningful ways that we can actually connect across the different disciplines? We started this conference as a way to cause these conversations to happen, to help share the fact that there were common methods and tools and data acquisition methods and methods for demonstrating and visualizing our findings, that they were happening throughout various disciplines, but you weren't always recognizing them. And so what we wanted this conference to do was to give an opportunity to share ideas, to share projects, and realize that you actually have an intellectual partner that's somewhere across this campus that can form a network, essentially, to help you move forward with your projects. And so I think we have done that. The last piece I'll observe, though, is in our early conferences, it was a speaker presenting on a project, one after another, which was wonderful. But we weren't yet ready to have the kinds of conversations we just had with this panel, that we could actually have the kind of discussion that we did that goes beyond the technology and goes beyond the techniques and ask some of the deeper questions that, regardless of discipline, we all need to be thinking about. And that's a maturation of the conversation here at Yale that is just so wonderful to see and experience. So we will continue to try to bring together these conversations and invite even a wider and wider audience to participate. So before we transition to our poster session, which will be right next door, I want to thank our different sponsors. We have Yale STEAM, Yale Code for Good, Yale's Digital Humanities Lab, and the Yale Poorvu Center for Teaching and Learning. Throughout the day, they've contributed in many different ways. And so if you would join me in a round of applause for our sponsors.